Welcome to Lecture 10. We are going to be talking about the complex process of choosing the right wheelchair for the right task for the right environment. We're going to be talking about wheelchair assessment and the selection of the correct type of seating. We need to take into consideration the user. There's going to be a whole team of professionals working together, equipment suppliers, family members, and perhaps people from the client's work or leisure environments who can all contribute useful information in the selection process. Wheelchairs enable functional mobility with whatever means the person has available. They facilitate mastery of the environment. They, of course, enable engagement in occupations and also participation in social activities. Wheelchairs promote functional posture by providing appropriate back, trunk, and leg supports, and they facilitate upper limb function, which can occur, of course, with proper trunk support. I want to just introduce you over here to my parents. These are my mom and my dad, who are now deceased. This was taken in 2017 on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Some of you may have heard of the Sea of Galilee, near a city called Tiberias, and this was at my niece's wedding. So for those of you who don't know, or I may not have shared this with you yet, my father had a spinal cord injury. I was a year old. He was about 32 years old. And in this picture, he is probably about 8 years old. Aside from promoting comfort and making sure that the person is protected from further injuries or deformities, the wheelchair has a functional orientation. So we need to consider the user's needs and goals. Primarily, we're going to consider the user and the family, whatever their goals are, for how they need to use the wheelchair as part of an overall functional mobility system. The therapist evaluates the skills of the user or the client who's going to be using the wheelchair, their ability to develop new skills to use a wheelchair, and any changes that are expected from the diagnosis. Of course, the therapist also is going to consider the environment in which the wheelchair will be used, and we'll talk a little bit about that moving forward. So our clients need to move. We all need to move. And if a client is non-ambulatory, meaning that they cannot propel themselves, or they cannot walk with their lower extremities, a variety of mobility devices are available, and our job to make a recommendation for the most appropriate kind of wheelchair. Now, seating and mobility is an area of assistive technology. An entry-level occupational therapist can screen the client to determine a need for a formal seating and mobility evaluation. If a client is screened and found to require a new wheelchair, a new seating system, we're going to refer them to a qualified wheelchair seating and mobility team. What do we actually mean by a screen versus an assessment? So a screening helps to determine if the client is currently positioned adequately in their seating system, in their chair and their seat, to see whether they need a formal assessment. The screening helps to determine if the client is efficient using their current wheelchair. And efficiency itself is defined as a combination of the time and effort that are required to use the system. So if the mobility currently is taking too long or it requires too much effort, then another method of mobility may be appropriate, meaning that it might be time to look at a different wheelchair and seating system. If a client isn't efficiently mobile, so they can't move adequately, or if they're unsafe, then further assessment is required. So in both of these situations, if the client is not efficient with their current seating and mobility system, those warrant a referral to an occupational therapist who is more specialized in conducting a formal wheelchair and seating evaluation. These are some screening questions to ask with the person sitting in their wheelchair using their current seating system. Let's look at the pelvis. We've learned all about the pelvis. Is it in a neutral position without a tilt, without obliquity or rotation? So the tilt and obliquity and rotation, those are the three different planes that the pelvis can be situated in. Anterior tilt or posterior tilt. Obliquity means that there's a lateral tilt, and a rotation is with one anterior superior iliac spine in front of another. If the pelvis is not in a neutral position, can it be corrected and maintained over time? Is the trunk upright and in midline symmetrical? Is the head upright and in midline? Is it balanced over the trunk? Are the extremities aligned with the pelvis without adduction of the femurs or abduction of the femurs or rotations? Regarding the back height, so with the pelvis in a neutral position, is the back at the correct height? So you will see people sitting in wheelchairs that have a very short back if you've got adequate trunk control, and of course depending on the type of mobility system that they need. There are people who've got a lot of back support with a very high back. So it just depends on what the client needs. The depth of the seat is important to consider. So with the pelvis in a neutral orientation, is there about a 1-inch gap between the back of the knee and the end of the seat cushion? So there needs to be room, there needs to be a little bit of a gap, about a 1-inch gap between the back of the knee, so the popliteal fossa, that's the back of the knee, and the end of the seat cushion. Why do you think that is? That's so the person, if they need to flex their knee, if they need to, for example, tuck their feet underneath their knees to transfer, that there's room for them to do that. And we'll learn more about the importance of being able to flex the knees and position the feet underneath the knees in preparation for shifting weight and transfer. So that's an important measurement. We'll get into that in a little bit. Lastly, we want to consider the length or the distance between the top of the knee and the floor. Usually there's going to be a foot plate over there, so we need to measure that distance to make sure that that distance is accurate for the client's needs and the type of seating system that they're going to be used. So if any of the answers to any of these questions is no, then further assessment is indicated. And I've mentioned before, and I'll mention it again, going forward, that the assessment is going to be done by an occupational therapist who has specialized training in conducting wheelchair and seating system assessments. So I mentioned that the wheelchair and seating assessment includes a team of specialists, and this assessment team, of course, includes first and foremost the client, the caregivers as well, the occupational and physical therapists who deal with functional mobility, and the equipment suppliers. Those are very, very important team members. Wheelchair seating falls under an area of complex rehabilitation technology, CRT. And so this means that this is technology that has to be personalized to the person. It's not an off-the-shelf product. Sometimes there are off-the-shelf products which are durable medical equipment that can be used for a patient, but most of the time, if a patient needs personalized adjustments, and that is our job, is to make sure that the wheelchair and the seating system are specific to our patient's needs. The moment things need to be adjusted and adapted for this person, it's considered a complex rehabilitation technology. Of course, as occupational therapists, we understand the importance of good positioning. So a postural alignment, we recognize when a seating system is not meeting the client's needs. I mentioned before that occupational therapists who perform these kinds of rehabilitation, these kinds of wheelchair assessments for the complex rehabilitation technology do have additional training and specialization. They may require some additional certification in some areas. The equipment supplier also will have specialized training. So some equipment suppliers, vendors, are assistive technology professionals and have the acronym ATP behind their name. The wheelchair seating assessment will follow a natural process. In the beginning, of course, the client will be interviewed, their family will be interviewed, they'll gather information, look at what they're currently using, and look at their current posture. It will be followed by an examination on an unsupported sitting surface, so a mat in the clinic. You've seen those in our gross motor labs. A therapy mat, the patient will be transferred on the mat and likely will undergo several types of assessments. For example, static and dynamic sitting balance. The therapist will assess their hand function, grip strength, their cognitive ability as well, to see whether they can learn new skills to operate a new piece of equipment. Next, the client will probably receive some kind of loaner equipment to simulate what it will be like for them in the wheelchair that they purchase, and they'll get to trial the equipment. Once it's determined that this is the appropriate equipment for the patient, the customizations will take place. So new parts will be fabricated and they'll be fitted for those parts. And then, of course, there'll be follow-up. We are very lucky over here in West Tennessee to have a clinic, a seating and mobility clinic. And that's one of the fieldwork sites that you may be lucky enough to go and see. But one of our alums, by the name of Andrew Hinkle, he's an occupational therapist, he's an alum of our program, and he specializes in seating and mobility, and hopefully you'll get to meet him. We will have an organized visit, like a field trip, to his clinic to see a lot of this complex rehabilitation technology. As mentioned before, the main goal for the wheelchair is for it to be functional. The seating system should provide optimal postural alignment and support, enough stability to help the patient improve their functional skills, and to compensate for any motor, sensory, visual, or cognitive impairments. And of course, function will vary by the client, meaning that not every wheelchair is suited for every client. Some other goals, of course, include postural alignment. So we're going to strive for the client's upright and symmetrical alignment. We want to provide stability, postural support. So once they are in line, there should be primary and secondary support surfaces to help them maintain the position. Pressure distribution is of utmost importance because the more pressure is distributed, the less likely the client is to develop any areas of pressure that could lead to a pressure ulcer or to lead to an injury. Pressure relief is essential, and so there are mechanisms that could be built into the seating system to allow for pressure relief. It's essential that pressure is relieved over longer periods of time. And then, of course, another secondary goal is mobility. The base is designed to provide independent or dependent mobility for the client. So, of course, we want our clients to be independent, but there are clients that need to be pushed by somebody else, right? They don't have the ability for independent propulsion. So the base of the seat is going to be designed according to that need. And we'll learn more about that coming up. The therapist evaluates the skills of the user's ability to develop new skills and changes that are expected from the client's diagnosis. So starting off with client factors and performance skills. The occupational therapist wants to look at the sensory system. For example, is there any areas of sensory loss that can place the person at risk for the development of pressure ulcers, which could necessitate a special seat cushion? The neuromuscular system. Does the client have increased muscle tone or decreased muscle tone? Do they have postural control? Do they have any abnormal reflexes? And what is their coordination like? Because those will also impact the seating selection. Look at musculoskeletal factors. For example, any physical limitations like range of motion limitations or deformities. Upper extremity strength is very important to assess, because if a person doesn't have sufficient upper extremity strength, for example, to propel themselves, that is going to impact the selection of the wheelchair system. Looking at respiratory status as well, because a compromised respiratory status will impede mobility, and it could require the selection of a powered wheelchair option. Looking at cognition, does the person have the ability to learn how to operate the controls? And then the psychosocial environment. So is there social support to help with transferring and transporting the wheelchair? So you can get a person the fanciest, most beautifully designed, well-fitted wheelchair, but if they can't get it through the doors of their home, then what's the point? That is actually something that happened with my father. My parents lived in an apartment in Israel on the second floor of a building. My dad got a beautiful power chair, but he couldn't get it into the elevator and into his home. So it was a real waste of a good wheelchair. More areas to assess are the age of the client and their developmental status. For example, are they going to need this wheelchair in school? And how are they going to get to and from school if you're dealing with a child? If you're dealing with a child, are you allowing for adjustments when they grow? What about adaptive equipment that they may need? For example, a computer or an augmented communication system. Does the wheelchair allow for other technologies to be fitted onto it? And is it socially acceptable to the client? We want to look at the nature of the disability. Is it temporary? So did they just have a hip replacement and they just need a wheelchair temporarily? Or is this going to be a permanent condition? For example, they've had an amputation and they're not going to get a prosthetic device to walk again, so they'll be permanently using a wheelchair. Is it a stable condition, like if, for example, if the person had a spinal cord injury, or is it a progressive injury? For example, does the person have multiple sclerosis or ALS? What about educational and work interests and pursuits? So, for example, does the person need the armrests of the wheelchair to be lowered so that the wheelchair can fit underneath the desk? So there are armrests called desk arms. They're lower, and they will allow for the wheelchair to fit underneath the desk. What about leisure interests and pursuits? So does this person have a special sport that they participate in? And there are wheelchairs that are designed for special sports, like basketball, for example. We want to consider the patient's daily routines and habits, their goals and desired occupations. And I've mentioned before, any other assistive technology or medical equipment that they need while they're in a wheelchair. For example, a ventilator. So in the picture we see a gentleman who is using a ventilator, and that's mounted onto his wheelchair. It's really important to look at the physical environment. I gave you the example of my father and his fancy wheelchair, which didn't fit through the elevator doors. So you want to see, where's this wheelchair going to be used? How will the person get the wheelchair to that area? Are the doorways wide enough? Are the hallways wide enough? Can the person access toilets, public toilets? What about parking? All of those things need to be considered in the selection of the wheelchair. And then finally we get to the actual characteristics of the wheelchair. Is it portable? Is it transportable? What is the quality of the ride? What are some other special features that are needed? For example, the brakes. So there's different kinds of braking systems. Ones that will brake if you push them forward, or ones that will brake if you push them backwards. There are special anti-tip devices that can be installed onto a wheelchair to make sure that the wheelchair doesn't flip over. But some people may not want those anti-tippers because they need to be able to flip themselves up into a wheelie. We'll talk about that a little bit more. How is the patient going to propel themselves? Are they going to use one arm and one leg if they've had a stroke? Or are they going to be using both upper extremities? Do the rims of the rear wheels need special projections to help them propel themselves? Do they need a motorized propulsion method? And then what other personalized features, does this wheelchair need to include? For example, a lap tray, a backpack, any postural supports, a headrest, etc. So I mentioned being pushed in a wheelchair, and we call that attendant propelled. That is usually a manual wheelchair, so it's a wheelchair that's pushed by somebody else. It's not going to be one of those motorized wheelchairs. So examples of attendant propelled wheelchairs could be an airplane aisle transit chair. If any of you have seen people in wheelchairs, or if you've gone to the airport recently, you might have seen the specialized aisle wheelchairs, and those are for somebody to be able to fit into a plane. So if somebody else is propelling them. There's specialized strollers that are attendant propelled. They are actually wheelchairs, but they're designed as strollers to be able to propel, to push a child or an adult who's better seated in a stroller type of chair. Then the middle picture shows you a manual chair. So that's the standard wheelchairs that we're used to seeing. There's usually a standard chair has got all four, two back wheels, two front wheels, and it's got room for both limbs. In the picture, you're seeing an amputee frame. So that is a specialized manual chair for somebody who's had one lower limb amputated. There's also something called a hemi chair. And so that is for somebody who's had a stroke who is going to propel the chair with one leg and one hand on the same side. On the right side of the slide, there are examples. There's an example of a powered chair, and this is one that can recline all the way back to relieve pressure. You have reclining power chairs, so those are people who are unable to maintain an upright sitting position. The wheelchair that you're looking at on the right is called a tilt in space chair, and as I mentioned, it provides pressure relief. There are also chairs that are used for sports, recreational. There are bariatric wheelchairs, meaning they are for adults who are oversized, so just not standard frame wheelchairs, but they're larger wheelchairs, and we call those bariatric chairs. So in considering the wheelchair, it's very important to think about what kind of chair are we going to need. Is it going to be a manual chair or a power chair? And the therapist also needs to think about the progression of the patient's condition. Are they stable? Is this a deteriorating condition? Because insurance companies expect the user to use the chair for at least 5 years unless there's a significant change in their condition or in their function. So all of these complex rehabilitation technologies need to have justification for medical necessity. And so the therapist has to justify why this chair is needed. Manual wheelchairs allow a person to be mobile. They're more portable than a power chair. They're more minimal equipment. Whereas power chairs allow for mobility for long distances. They're more appropriate for people who don't have the arm strength to be able to propel themselves. They allow for multiple seating positions, and they can accommodate specialized technology. For example, if somebody needs specialized technology for communication, then a power chair can accommodate such technology. There are some basic components to a wheelchair that you need to be familiar with. Let's start off with the wheels. The large back wheels are the rear wheels. They're not always big, so sometimes they might be the same size as the front wheels, which are known as the caster wheels. So for example, in a transport wheelchair, one that's an attendant propelled wheelchair, you may have 4 small wheels. But the rear wheels typically are larger and have a push rim or a push ring on them. The front wheels are called the caster wheels. There are armrests. Sometimes they're removable, but sometimes they're welded into the frame, which doesn't help very much with adjustments. You can have armrests that flip up and out of the way. You can have armrests that completely detach from the wheelchair, and those could be important if somebody needs to transfer using a transfer board, which we'll learn about in one of our labs. There are foot plates and leg rests. Sometimes they're fixed and sometimes they can be folded out of the way. We want them to fold out of the way, especially when we're doing transfers. There's attachments and extra things that can be added to the wheelchair. So, for example, a person may need a seat belt. The seat belt typically goes across the hips, not the waist. So it goes across the hips at a 45-degree angle to help keep the person seated with a neutral pelvis in the correct position. There may be harnesses if the person doesn't have enough trunk control. There may be arm troughs, so special channels, if you will, for the arms to be positioned in. There could be head supports to allow for improved eye contact, for communication, for feeding assistance. There might be brake extensions to help the person gain leverage when they're using their brakes, and all manner of other attachments and adjustments that can be made to wheelchairs. Manual wheelchairs will be recommended for people who can propel themselves, and they can use brakes using their upper extremities. There's many different types of manual wheelchairs. There's folding frames, there's rigid frames, there's ones that are made specifically for people who've had a stroke, so they're called hemi frames, and you can get wheelchairs that are very, very lightweight or ultra lightweight, or just standard, made out of standard metal. And so all of these things are things that would be considered by the evaluation team. A motorized or power wheelchair is used for somebody who has trouble propelling themselves using their own arms, or for somebody who doesn't have enough energy to manually propel themselves, or for somebody where it's contraindicated for them to be propelling themselves. Somebody also with compromised shoulder function is going to be better served with a power or motorized wheelchair, and somebody who's prone to repetitive stress injury. So if you think about propelling a wheelchair, that's a lot of repetitive motion. Somebody who's prone to having an injury from repetitive use may be better served by a motorized wheelchair. Power wheelchairs are complex rehabilitation technologies that include a full range of seating, driving methods, and power steering options. So just some words that you should be familiar with when we're talking about power wheelchairs are tilt. So tilt means that the entire seat can change position. There's tilt and recline. So in reclining, the angle between the seat and the back can be open. That is what a recline is. The seat height can be adjusted, so it can be increased. The seat from the floor, the height from the floor to the seat can be extended to also increase functional reach. There could be elevating leg rests that help to improve range of motion at the knees, to decrease edema, especially if combined with a tilt. So that's to help get the blood back to the heart by raising the legs above the level of the heart. And there are power chairs that will even transform into a stander. So here is a picture of a power chair that comes to a full upright standing position. There are also many different ways to drive a power chair. So driving a power chair can be, using a simple joystick that most of us are familiar with from maybe video games. But there are also systems which use complicated switches. You've heard of sip and puff mechanisms. So that's when a person uses something like a straw and they suck and puff on the straw, and that gives different commands to the powertrain to drive the wheelchair. A person can use different switches on a head array. So by tilting and changing the position of their head and neck, that can activate different switches on the back of the head that command the steering mechanism as well. There could be switches inside their mouth. So there's a picture over here of switches on a person's upper palate. And there's a diagram showing the location of different switches to enable driving a power chair. And there's more than this, but these are some examples of driving methods. Power wheelchairs can be greatly advantageous and they're very fancy. It's like a big vehicle, really, a big car, but there are disadvantages. A lot of them are really bulky. They're large and heavy. They're difficult to maneuver in small spaces. They're difficult to transport from one place to another. They need a larger turning radius than a standard wheelchair. So because they need a larger turning radius, they also need more room. So the environment needs to be more spacious with bigger doorways, etc. If transporting them in vans, the roof of the van often needs to be raised or the floor needs to be lowered. If a person's going to be staying in the wheelchair, it's very difficult to transfer in and out of a wheelchair just for the purposes of getting into a vehicle or a van. And then some of the more lighter weight power chairs, a lot of times we see them, scooters, they have difficulty going up and down inclines, and uneven surfaces, so that would be a difficulty. I'd like you to explore some of the videos that I have for you on some really cool technologies, different kinds of wheelchairs that you may or may not have seen. Let's talk about the actual seat surface and the cushioning. So you can't have everything in one cushions. Patients are going to qualify for cushions based on their diagnosis. There's a variety of materials that the cushion can be made of. There's different kinds of foams, like memory foams, and more spongy, less spongy, more dense. There's gels, there's air-filled cushions, and there's special like honeycomb-shaped plastics. I actually sleep on a purple mattress, which has a kind of similar idea of what I'm talking about, the honeycomb-shaped plastic. It's a specialized plastic that conforms to the shape of my body when I sleep. And I love my mattress. So there are seating systems that are made out of similar material. The covering is also going to be important. You want to think about heat and moisture. So if you're sitting all day long, you want to think of the buildup that occurs from the body up against the surface, the friction as well, how durable the material is, and of course it's got to be cosmetically appealing or at least acceptable to the user. Some seats and back surfaces you can buy off the shelf. Listen, if you stop at any truck stop on the way home at a gas station, you're going to find different kinds of seats, seat cushions or back rests for your car. But of course, the better alternative for our patients is going to be customized seat and back surfaces. We want to make sure that the characteristics of the cushion match our patient's needs, so they should reduce pressures from bony prominences. They want to provide postural stability and control, help with transfer. So if you have a very soft seat, it might be more difficult to get in and out of that chair because of the amount of contact that the soft material provides with the rest of the body. The cushion also needs to be able to accommodate a deformity. It needs to provide protection against moisture, and it should be easy to maintain. That's a lot to ask for in a seat cushion, don't you think? In general, we can categorize seating systems using these descriptors. Either it's a sling. So in our clinic, in the lab, we will be using wheelchairs. Mostly we'll be using wheelchairs that have a sling back and a sling seat. So sling upholstery is one category. Another category that's available only on a power mobility base is a captain's seat. We'll see an example of that coming up. There's off-the-shelf cushions that we just spoke about. There's customized cushions that I also mentioned. And then there's something called an amputee seat, and I'll show you a picture of that. But that is a specialized shape of a seat, and that's to help prevent contractures. Here is a captain's chair. So it's a similar seat that we find in our vehicles. It's not designed for a client who's going to be sitting for a long period of time because it's not customized. It's for somebody who's going to transfer to another seat once they arrive at their destination. So we talked about off-the-shelf cushions. So those are just generic cushions that you can buy from a store, from a catalog. They're not conformed specifically to the person's contours or shape, but they're generally, they help the patient to remain in a certain position. Customized cushions, on the other hand, are designed to be matched specifically to the client. They provide the most surface contact with the client. So they're also going to be, they're going to be more contoured toward the client. They might be a little bit more difficult to transfer out of, but that's okay because if the client is going to be sitting in the chair for extended periods of time, we want the contour to conform to their body without any areas of pressure. So these are molded seating systems. That really closely almost hug the patient. I promised you a picture of an amputee seat, and here it is. You can see it has an L shape, and the purpose of this seat, in this particular picture, the left leg is going to remain in extension. So the idea is to keep the knee extended. So if the person has had a below knee amputation, for example, just below the knee, the tendency is for those hamstrings to contract and for the knee to flex. The problem is that often people develop a flexion contracture at the knee, and then when they get a prosthetic device to try and walk in, they can't fit it because they've got a contracture. They can't extend the knee, and we need knee extension in order to stand, right? So this type of seat encourages the knee to remain extended once it's been amputated. Pressure mapping is a great technique that helps to guide the occupational therapist in making the right selection and adjustments to the seat. So over here we see two people who are both sitting in the same kind of chair, but they were sitting on the specialized sheet of plastic that maps pressure areas according to the way that they're seated. And we can see that the gentleman on the right, there are two bright red areas. Those are two pressure points for his ischial tuberosities. The gentleman on the left, we can see a more even pressure distribution. The gentleman on the right also appears to have much longer thighs, so he has got more pressures. His thighs aren't fully supported. So it's very important to have full support underneath the thighs to distribute the pressures away from bony areas. I want to take a minute to talk about pressure ulcers. This is really, really important for us to understand. Now, pressure ulcers are diagnosed by specialists. We do not have the authority to look at a wound and decide whether it's a pressure ulcer or not. But they are extremely common for people who use a wheelchair, especially those who lack sensation and have limited mobility. So pressure ulcers need to be avoided at all costs. It's going to involve routines, so sitting schedules. A patient needs to shift their position about every 15 to 30 minutes to help with circulation, to help relieve pressure from a spot. There's different techniques and different chair designs. We mentioned some of those tilt-in space chairs. Those are used for pressure relief. But also being active, for the patient to be sitting in the wheelchair but actively weight shifting. So doing various occupations, being engaged in occupations. If they have trunk control and upper extremity control, they can shift their weight adequately. That is the best prevention technique to prevent pressure ulcers from developing in the first place. Different kinds of cushions are used for pressure relief. There's high density foams or memory foams. Gel is good. Air is considered the best, but it's not really the best. It's a little bit finicky. Basically, these are different cells in a seat cushion, and you pump it full of air. The issue about air-filled cushions is that air pressure needs to be monitored and adjusted just like the tire pressure in your car. So air can leak out. And so periodically that air pressure needs to be adjusted. So that's just another thing that the user needs to worry about. Foam can break down over time, and gel is really good. There's a brand of cushions called Roho, and they are considered the gold standard. But as I mentioned, they're high maintenance. Not everybody qualifies, and so the Roho are specifically air-filled cushions. I mentioned that the best pressure relief is being active, so doing wheelchair push-ups, leaning sideways, leaning forwards, and then of course tilting in space, but that's not available in every single wheelchair. Let's talk a little bit about tilt and recline functions of wheelchairs. So it's really important that the client's position is changed either manually, independently, or in a power chair. So there are manual chairs that have a tilt function, but that needs to be done by the attendant. Power chairs also have a tilt function, and that can be managed by the user themselves. Tilting is not the same as reclining. Tilting is when the entire seat changes its angle, and reclining is when the back opens up, so the angle between the seat and the back opens. In the picture, we see a reclining seat. Often tilt and recline go together. Okay, so the tilt moves the seating system posteriorly without changing the angle between the back and the seat, whereas the recline changes the angle, opens up that angle between the back and the seat. So reclining, it's like when you go for a haircut or to get your hair shampooed, and you sit in a chair and you recline backwards to get your hair shampooed. That is a recline. Or if you're reclining backwards to get your beard shaved, if you're a guy. That is a reclining seat. That's not necessarily a tilting seat. There's many advantages to a tilt and recline. It helps, of course, with pressure redistribution. It helps with kind of getting back into alignment. It helps with posture. Helps with fatigue if you want to just lean back and rest a little bit. Helps to get your heart rate settled. Just being in a reclined position, almost like a supine position, helps in many different ways. And so tilt and recline is often a feature that we have to justify medical necessity for, but we can talk about that later. So if you are evaluating a client for a wheelchair, that means that you have specialized in this area. You are going to be writing many, many letters to justify the seating system that you chose. So the seating system should allow for pressure relief, as we just mentioned, and for freedom of movement. So if the client requires a tilt in space or a reclining feature, you're going to have to write a letter to justify those features. It has to relate to medical necessity. So if the client is at risk for developing pressure areas and pressure sores because they have lack sensation or they lack the ability to move, you're going to use that knowledge to justify why they need the seating system. We want to make sure that we're protecting the user from any secondary complications that can come from being immobile. Don't worry too much about writing letters to justify medical necessity at this point. A lot of the vendors, the equipment vendors have already done that work for you. So there's templates for justifying medical necessity for seating systems. Just because they've done the work doesn't mean that the patient will always be accepted or that the insurance will always accept the justification. I don't want you to be too freaked out about justifying medical necessity. I just want you to know that that is part of the role of the occupational therapist when making these determinations. Common positioning challenges relate primarily to the pelvis, to the orientation of the pelvis. Is it tilted, rotated, or does it have an obliquity? Another common challenge relates to the position of the head and how much head control the person has, if they lack head control or if they have lateral cervical flexion or rotation of the head. Different leg lengths can also be challenging to accommodate in a wheelchair, or if the knees are wider than the hips, or if the person has a windswept deformity. And so we have some pictures over here of people who've had windswept deformities. This is just a common term to describe when the knees point in one direction and the ankles point in a different direction. Let's talk about measuring a wheelchair or measuring for a wheelchair. So a major principle in seating is the need to provide the individual with a solid base of support that begins with appropriate pelvic positioning. We want to make sure that the pelvis is stabilized on a firm surface and that the pressure is distributed throughout the buttocks and the full length of each thigh. The wheelchair size, of course, needs to be proportional to the person. Wherever possible, we want to use a standard size chair because the more we change the size, the more expensive that custom chair is going to be. But regardless, we want to make sure that the wheelchair fits our patient. The width of the seat needs to be a little bit wider, about 2 inches wider than the widest point of the patient. So if you're going to measure the widest point when the patient is seated, we're going to go from one greater trochanter to the other. So the greater trochanters are the points of the widest points of the hips. There's going to be a little bit of extra tissue over there, but basically you're going from one side to the other side, and you're going to add 2 inches so that there's some clearance on the side to prevent the clothing from rubbing and causing friction, and also to allow for weight shifting and pressure relief. Now you don't want it any wider than 1 inch clearance on each side, so that's that extra 2 inches, because if the seat is wider, then that becomes problematic for the position of the armrests. If the armrests are too wide, that also can inhibit function. So 1 inch clearance on each side is sufficient to measure for the seat width. So again, we're going from greater trochanter to the other, measuring the widest part of the hips and adding 2 inches to arrive at the appropriate seat width. For the seat depth, this is going to be a little bit tricky. We're going to measure the longest thigh. Okay, so our thighs aren't always equal in length. We're going to measure the longest thigh from the back, right, the posterior portion of the buttocks. Okay, so that's the back side that's going to come into contact with the back of the seat, all the way to the popliteal fossa. So that is the back of the knee. I mentioned this earlier in the slideshow. So all the way to the back of the knee, to the popliteal fossa, and we're going to subtract 1 to 2 inches. And that is going to allow for knee flexion and to prevent clothing from bunching up behind the knee and causing a pressure sore, rubbing. If the leg swells, and we want some movement, to allow some movement over there, and then also to allow for leg swing and leg flexion during transfers. So the depth of the seat is going to be from the back side, right, the back of the buttocks, all the way to the back of the knee, minus 1 to 2 inches to get that clearance behind the knee. The back height is going to be dependent on the user's needs and abilities. If they have good postural control, they can get away with a shorter back height, but they may need a taller or longer back, a higher back if they lack postural control and need more supports to maintain an upright position. We can measure the seat height that is needed. So that's going to also be dependent on the client's ability and how they're going to propel themselves. For example, if they're going to propel themselves using their feet, so they're going to walk their wheelchair, walk in a seated position, then we're going to measure the height from their heels all the way to the back of their knees, right, to that popliteal fold. And that height will enable them to propel themselves using their feet. But if their feet are going to be resting in footrests, so for example, if a patient has had a spinal cord injury and they're paralyzed from the waist down and cannot use their feet, then they're going to rest their feet in footrests. We're going to take that same measurement from the back of the knee all the way to the heel, but we need to add height to that seat to allow for clearance for those footrests. So usually an added 2 inches. So whatever that length is from the heel to the back of their knees, plus 2 inches for somebody who will need footrests on their wheelchair. What about the armrests? Too low or too high could be problematic. So we're going to measure with the shoulders adducted and elbows flexed to 90 degrees what that height should be. If the armrests are too low, that means the patient is going to lean forward to get contact between the elbow and the armrest. So it's going to make them lean forward. If the armrests are too high, they're going to end up with shoulder elevation and be very, very uncomfortable. Once our client has received their wheelchair, we need to provide instruction, right? So how are we going to use the wheelchair? Of course, we've already assessed their cognitive capacity to learn new skills. We've assessed their physical capability of using the device. And we've assessed the needs of the caregiver or the attendant, right? And we've determined what their goals are. Now we're going to provide instruction. So firstly, how to propel themselves indoors and outdoors on a variety of different surfaces. We're going to educate them on the correct sitting posture, on techniques for pressure relief, on methods to lock the brakes and unlock the brakes, on positioning themselves for transfers, getting into and out of the wheelchair. There might be additional devices that are used with the wheelchair, for example, lap boards or specialized gloves so that they can propel themselves without getting any hand injuries. We're going to instruct them on how to transport the wheelchair and how to maintain the wheelchair. So, of course, we're always going to make sure that they can use their wheelchair, and the therapist should always provide periodic checks. So initially, of course, we're going to do an assessment, make sure that they are trained, received instruction, and understand what needs to be done, but we want to also include periodic follow-ups to address any safety issues, to make sure that the wheelchair still fits them correctly, see if any adjustment needs to be made, and update them on any new options, new technologies that could be beneficial to them. When it comes to power wheelchairs, it gets a little bit more complicated because many power wheelchair candidates may have impaired motor, vision, and cognitive skills. They may never have seen somebody driving a power wheelchair. And power mobility can be quite complicated, but people may have received very little training. Training is really, really important to help the client develop readiness to use a power wheelchair and to refine their driving skills. Of course, power wheelchairs are going to provide independent mobility to clients, but if a client hasn't learned to use all the capabilities of the chair, then we really aren't helping to maximize their potential. To use a manual wheelchair, of course, we want our client to be independent with propulsion. It's important that they have two limbs that are functional, so either both upper extremities, both lower extremities, or one upper and one lower extremity. They also should have good trunk control and balance, and of course, sound mental functions. We want our clients to be efficient when they use their wheelchairs. So each stroke means each time they push on the wheel. So efficient push strokes will result in less strokes per day, so less repetition and hopefully less chance of a repetitive strain injury. The axle of the wheelchair should be directly under the shoulders so that when they reach back, when they extend their shoulders, the hand is at the 11 o'clock position. So if we imagine the wheel, the rear wheel, as a clock with 12 o'clock directly underneath the client's shoulder, if they extend their shoulder and position their hand at 11 o'clock, and push all the way through 2 o'clock on the clock wheel, on the wheel clock, that is what an efficient stroke is. Okay? And once they push, they should allow the wheelchair to glide before doing the next stroke. They should also minimize the weight of the chair so that it's not as difficult to push. In this slide, I want to tell you a little bit about how the center of gravity of a wheelchair can be altered by the position of the rear wheels. So we can make, by altering the position of the rear wheels, we can make the wheelchair more or less stable. Because the center of gravity is directly related to the position of those rear wheels. Now, if we move that rear wheel backwards, we're effectively increasing the base of support of that wheelchair. If you think the distance between the rear wheels and the caster wheels in the front, that distance is going to increase. And so the base, the frame, the base of the wheelchair, the points of contact with the ground are larger, and that is going to be a more stable wheelchair. Whereas if we move the rear wheels forward towards the front caster wheels, we're actually decreasing the base of support of the wheelchair. We're decreasing the stability of the wheelchair. When we move the rear wheels forward and decrease the stability of the wheelchair, we also decrease its resistance to rolling. So we make the whole wheelchair a little less stable. Now that could be a good thing because it helps the patient to pop a wheelie. What does that mean, popping a wheelie? We're going to talk about it in a few slides. But that basically means that the patient tips the wheelchair backwards in order to raise the front wheels over a curve. So popping a wheelchair could be very effective, but it's not for everybody. Only for those who know how to control their body weight, their center of gravity, they have good trunk control, and they know what they're doing. When we move that rear wheel backwards, further backwards, we get a more stable wheelchair, but it's not going to allow the user to pop a wheelie. It also makes the strokes less efficient because the person sitting in the wheelchair has to extend further back, extend their shoulder further back in order to achieve a stroke. On the other hand, if we move that rear wheel forward, it's going to decrease the base of support of the wheelchair, and it's going to make that wheelchair less stable and help the patient get into a wheelie position if they want to pop a wheelie. It also makes the strokes a little bit easier and longer. A person can receive a perfectly well-fitting wheelchair but still not be able to access the environment because of barriers in the built environment. So if we think of an average wheelchair being about 24 to 26 inches wide from one room to the next, the average doorway is about 32 inches. So that doesn't leave a whole lot of room on either side of the wheelchair. So, for example, for the person's hands to be able to propel themselves, that's very little wiggle room to go through the door. A minimum clearance for a doorway needs to be 32 inches. For a hallway, ideally we want a 36-inch width. Doorways can be widened, so removing door stops can help to add a little bit of space, and replacing hinges with offset hinges can also help to add some width. The average length of the wheelchair is about 42 inches. So it's not enough just to consider the width of the wheelchair, like going through a doorway or going down the hallway, but we also need to consider turning in the wheelchair, turning around. So there's the turning radius that is needed is at least a 5-foot turning radius. That means a 60-inch all around to be able to turn, to do a 360-degree turn, to be able to change directions and go somewhere else in the house. If we're thinking about the height of a countertop, so countertops should be between 28 and 34 inches from the ground. If we're going to reach for items from a sitting position, either leaning forward or leaning sideways, then the maximum height for a table or a countertop or a cabinet handle should be no more than 4 feet off the ground, or 48 inches. We just discussed some architectural barriers indoors. Now let's go outdoors. There are plenty that we can talk about, but let's just talk about two special considerations. The first one is ramps. So ramps at minimum need to be 36 inches wide, just like a hallway in a home. They should also have non-skid surfaces. Now, there's a special ratio that you need to know about, and it says that for every 1 inch of rise of the ramp, there should be at least 12 inches of slope or ramp. So if you need to enter a building that has a step up to the entrance of 1 foot, okay, 1 foot is the same as 12 inches, okay, 1 foot. So there are 12 inches of rise. How many inches of slope do there need to be? Well, I'll tell you. There should be 12 feet of slope, so 144. You're going to have some questions about this, about the slope to rise, that ratio. Okay, so for every 1 inch of rise, there are 12 inches or 1 foot of slope. For every 1 inch of rise, 1 foot of slope. Another consideration outdoors is, of course, parking spaces. So when we're parking and need to get a wheelchair out, there should be at least 4 feet of an aisle next to the parking space to allow the wheelchair user to get in and out of the vehicle and to maneuver. Can't tell you how many times parking spaces for people in wheelchairs are taken up by people who don't need them, who can walk. It's a pet peeve of mine because I saw it affect my father throughout his life. So please just remember, parking spaces for people with wheelchairs are really important to keep them available for them. One last thing that I want to mention about ramps is that sometimes ramps are very long, and they need to have breaks, flat areas or platforms where a person can turn and rest. Well, firstly, where a person can rest, but also to allow for turns, right? Because most ramps that are long are going to have these hairpin 180-degree turns or that a wheelchair user needs to make in order to go up the next slope. So those landings are critical. Those also need to be to at least 5 by 5 feet wide to allow for the wheelchair to turn. They're so important to help the person propelling themselves up the ramp to rest, to take a rest, to give themselves a break, to catch their breath, right, and to start again. So the other consideration is if the ramp is leading up to a door, right, there needs to be a landing before the door so that the door can swing open without the person having to back up and then slide down the ramp. So those are just some other considerations that I wanted to mention about ramps. Okay, that's it. You made it through this very long lecture. I hope you're all doing well, and I will see you soon in class.